What a theme. What a theme. But yeah, there was a lot of collaboration, a lot of like research, and we had the Black History Month committee doing, all the work, reaching out to speakers and putting everything together, which I'm really thankful for that. And but for now, I just want to welcome everyone. For today, we will be hosting Professor Sarita Cannon, and Jumoke Akin-Taylor will be um, anchoring that. So I'm just going to share my screen quickly, and we're going to walk through the events that we have planned for the month. So for today, the 7th, Jumoke Akin-Taylor will host Professor Sarita Cannon on narratives of Black resistance. That'll be for today, and all the events are on Tuesdays from noon hour to 1 p.m. For the 14th, Corey Jackson will be hosting Arnold Townsend on Black resistance and ethnic studies at SF State. For Tuesday, February 21, Beth Rubenstein will be, and Robin Takayama will co-host award-winning filmmaker and longtime social justice activist John Osaki on his movie Reparations. And then on Thursday, February 23rd, at noon hour to 1, in collaboration with Black History Month Planning Committee, in collaboration with the monthly Inspecting Our Foundation series, will co-host Patrick Rivera. Oh, I'm sorry. Patrick Rivera and Jumoke Akin-Taylor will have a talk with Chuck Collins and Mickey Imura on development, race, and the Western edition. And on Tuesday, February 28th, at noon to 1, we're going to have the grand finale and the potluck celebration at the operations yard. So we would love to have you all join us, and we will be, as we celebrate the events. So for today, we're having Professor Sarita Cannon. She is with us. Professor Sarita Cannon is with the English department at San Francisco State University, where she teaches courses on 20th century American literature. Professor Sarita Cannon also has authored a book. It's called Black Native Autobiographical Acts, Navigating the Minefields of Authenticity. So yeah, I'm really excited about the events for this month. And for me, I see it as a journey, a learning journey. And I want to invite everyone to, come on board as we go through this learning series. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Jumoke.
Thank you, Beryl. And I just want to also lend my voice to Beryl's in thanking everyone for joining. I believe this is our 6th or 7th year of celebrating Black History Month at Public Works. And special thanks to Kala, the interim director, for joining this great event. And just to how far we've come in the 7 years that we've been doing this as a way of celebrating our cultural heritage and our diversity and our strength as an organization. So thank you for the continued support. And this is an interesting topic. And Sarita is absolutely brilliant. And we would hear from her and her book. I had the pleasure of meeting her a couple of weeks ago. And so sharing that pleasure with all of you here today as she takes us through her presentation. Thank you, Sarita. And we'll have a session for questions and answers as well once she's done with her presentation. Over to you. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you. I'm going to pull up my slide deck here. And put this in slideshow mode. Okay. Is that visible? Can everybody see that? Okay, wonderful. Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much to Beo and Jumoke and the Planning Committee for inviting me to participate in this Black History Month panel series. I am really heartened to see such a wonderful presence of the African diaspora at the San Francisco Public Works. And I'm really grateful for the work that you are doing to lift up Black people and to educate all people about Black folks' contributions, not just in the United States, but globally. I'll give you an overview of my presentation. I really want this to be as interactive as possible, and welcome your comments, questions. So my presentation today stems from a question that many of us have confronted. What gives me strength to move forward in the face of multiple systematic oppressions that trample the most vulnerable among us? Many answers come to mind: the fortitude of the ancestors, the possibility in my sweet son's smile, teaching students from all walks of life, creating and appreciating music, art, and literature. Today, I'd like to share how some of these elements steady me and soothe me in a decidedly unsteady and unsoothing world. My talk, entitled Resistance, Resilience, and Reaping Joy, is divided into 3 sections, and it draws on my scholarship, teaching, and life experiences. I want to acknowledge, even before we start, that these 3 ideas, resistance, resilience, and joy, are all interconnected. They often exist simultaneously, and the boundaries between them are often fluid. So I look forward to your comments and questions, and I've also included on this opening page my email address, and you can find me on the San Francisco State website if you'd like to reach out after the event today to keep the conversation going. Okay. So first part, resistance. Several years ago, I saw an incredible performance of Lorraine Hansberry's play, The Sign in Sidney Brustein's Window, at the Oregon Shakespeare Festival in Ashland. Focusing on a diverse group of friends living in Greenwich Village in the 1960s who were struggling between idealism and realism, this play is less well known than her iconic 1959 play, A Raisin in the Sun, but it similarly highlights Hansberry's ability to craft characters whose humanity shines through on the page and on the stage. Near the end of the play, the title character, Sidney Brustein, a white Jewish liberal man who has numbed himself to physical and emotional pain and failed at his attempts at human connection, says to his wife, Iris, who is mourning the recent suicide of her sister, Gloria, "Yes, weep now, darling, weep. Let us both weep. This is the first thing, to let ourselves feel again. Then tomorrow we shall make something strong of this sorrow." The pathos of this exquisite line and the wonder at what Hansberry accomplished in her short 34 years before her death from pancreatic cancer inspired me to design and eventually teach a graduate seminar at San Francisco State entitled Lorraine Hansberry and Her Contemporaries. While preparing for the class, I came across a 1964 letter to the editor of the New York Times, in which Hansberry wrote about different modes of resistance that she had witnessed within her own family. She writes, "I remember my desperate and courageous mother patrolling our house all night with a loaded German Luger, doggedly guarding her 4 children, while my father fought the respectable part of the battle in the Washington court." Here, Hansberry is referring to the preparations her mother, Nanny Hansberry, made to defend her family from violence after they moved into a primarily white neighborhood in Chicago in 1937, and to the suit against the city's restrictive housing covenants that her father, Carl Hansberry, with NAACP lawyers, took all the way to a Supreme Court victory in 1940. She demonstrates a keen awareness of the multiple ways in which people of African descent in the US have fought for their right to live with dignity, calling into question the idea that there is any real difference between radical and respectable resistance. I deeply appreciate and often return to Hansberry's point that as people of African descent, especially in the Americas, we must utilize the many tools at our disposal to continue to resist the devastating effects of white supremacy. There are many artists, writers, and activists whose resistance inspires me, but today I'd like to look at two: Harriet Jacobs and Jimi Hendrix. So Harriet Jacobs, in her 1861 text, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, she exposes the unique horrors of slavery for women. Jacobs was born enslaved in 1813 in North Carolina. However, for over a century, scholars assumed that the text was actually a novel written by a white abolitionist. And it was only in 1981 that Jean Fagan Yellen was able to authenticate Jacobs' authorship. And part of the confusion comes from the fact that Jacobs uses a pseudonym for herself, Linda Brent, and for all of the book's characters. Faced with the lechery of her master, Dr. Flint, Linda, or Jacobs, makes the decision as a young girl to enter a sexual relationship with another white man. In doing so, she hopes to avoid being raped by her master and to secure the freedom of the children she will bear with this other man. Linda eventually runs away from her master, spending 7 years in her grandmother's attic. She is unable to secure children's freedom until they're much older, but by the time she writes this narrative, she and her children are all safely in the North. In this remarkable text, which I highly recommend to everybody in this room, it's in the public domain, available online. Jacobs writes about the particular challenges of being a woman and a mother in slavery, explicitly asking the white women of the North to recognize how degrading slavery is and to take action by joining the abolitionist cause. The very act of writing, especially of autobiographical texts, has long been a mode of resistance for Black Americans. The slave narrative provided an opportunity for people of African descent to express themselves, to support the abolitionist cause, and to reach a broad audience. And despite the vast diversity within African American autobiography, two recurring themes in all of these texts is, one, the notion of writing as a form of freedom, and two, the idea that the individual is often expected to speak both for herself and for her community. Jacobs resisted by bravely writing about her life, which itself was marked by multiple acts of resistance. As I mentioned, she decided at the age of 14, in order to avoid being raped by her enslaver, to start a relationship with a white man in the community, even though she risked her grandmother's condemnation in doing so. She also resisted by making her master believe that she had fled to the North, all while she was right under his nose, hiding in her grandmother's attic, just around the corner. And in the following passage, which I'll share in the next slide, she shares the agony of seeing her two children, but being unable to talk to them or hold them. So this is where she writes about creating this hole in the attic. I thus succeeded in making one hole about an inch long and an inch broad. I sat by it till late into the night to enjoy the little whiff of air that floated in. In the morning, I watched for my children. The first person I saw in the street was Dr. Flint. I had a shuddering, superstitious feeling that it was a bad omen. Several familiar faces passed by. At last, I heard the merry laughing of children, and presently 2 sweet little faces were looking up at me, as though they knew I was there and were conscious of the joy they imparted, how I longed to tell them I was there. Now, the chapter in which she describes her 7 years in this garret is called The Loophole of Retreat. And she does find a loophole in the institution of slavery by hiding in plain sight. She also finds a way to mother her children, despite the conditions that make it hard for her and for all enslaved mothers to be consistent, loving, and present anchors for their children. Later, she describes the wild goose chase that she sends her enslaver on by writing him letters that she asks a friend to send from New York. So she writes, he soon after receiving this letter, started for New York in haste, saying to his family that he had a business of great importance to transact. I peeped at him as he passed on his way to the steamboat. It was a satisfaction to have miles of land and water between us, even for a little while. And it was a still greater satisfaction to know that he believed me to be in the free states. my little den seemed less dreary than it had done. He returned, as he did from his former journey to New York, without obtaining any satisfactory information. So even in the most desperate of circumstances, she was left physically disabled by her 7 years in a 9 by 7 by 5 foot space. Jacobs not only outwitted her enslaver, but she also reversed his objectifying white male gaze. From her 12th year, Dr. Flint was always watching Jacobs, his eyes communicating his lustful lechery. Yet in the attic, Jacobs kept an eye on him and watched him squirm as he vainly searched for her. Eventually, Jacobs was able to free herself and her children. She worked in New York looking after the freed children of an abolitionist and wrote her 1861 narrative during her spare moments. During the Civil War, she provided relief for Union soldiers, and after the war, she and her daughter founded schools for freedmen and women. She died in 1890 and is buried in Mount Auburn Cemetery in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Her courage and generosity nourished me, as it did her biographer, Jean Fagan Yellen, who wrote of Jacobs, "She was, in Emerson's sense, representative, expressing the idea of the struggle for freedom. Her life empowers others. On my desk, her portrait, smiling, urges me onward." So I'd like to move about 100 years forward into the 20th century to a very different kind of resistance in Jimi Hendrix, who is the subject of the 3rd chapter of my book, Black Native Autobiographical Acts, Navigating the Minefields of Authenticity. In this book, I analyze how Black Native Americans navigate narratives of racial and ethnic authenticity through a variety of autobiographical forms. By close reading scrapbooks by Sylvester Longlands, oral histories from Black Americans enslaved by American Indians, the music of Jimi Hendrix, photographs of contemporary Black Indians, and the performances of former Miss Navajo, Radmilla Cody, I argue that people who straddle Black and Indigenous identities in the US unsettle biological, political, and cultural metrics of racial authenticity. I'd like to talk briefly today about how Jimi Hendrix, a man who claimed African, European, and Cherokee ancestry, resisted racial and musical categorization. So we'll hope and pray that this YouTube video works. And I don't think this clip needs any introduction. Sorry for the ad.
Canada invites you to go on.
Yes?
You will need to share the sound.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Let's see. How do I?
So on the share, there's an arrow next to share.
Yes.
Then you should be able to see share sound. Do you see that?
Sorry, let me check this. Oh yeah, okay.
You see? Okay.
Yes. Thank you. See if this works.
Works.
All right, it seems quite sacrilegious to stop in the middle, but for the sake of time, I'll stop it there. So this is perhaps, can everybody see my slide? Is the slide?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Perhaps the most famous performance of the late Jimi Hendrix, this rendition of the US national anthem at Woodstock Festival, became an emblem of 1960s counterculture. Not merely an expression of collective consciousness, Hendrix's performance was also an important autobiographical statement that gestured towards his relationship with the country of his birth and his own multicultural identity as a Black Cherokee American. Although he was limited to a certain extent by the fierce racial divisions of his era, Hendrix strove to resist musical, racial, and political categorization. Hendrix's performance has often been understood as a critique of the US government's involvement in the Vietnam War. In an interview with Dick Cavett after the Woodstock performance, the talk show host asks the musician to respond to the controversial nature of his rendition of the anthem. And Hendrix said, "I don't know, man. All I did was play it. I'm American, so I played it. I used to sing it at school. They made me sing it at school, so it was a flashback." Anticipating the nasty letters that might arrive in Hendrix's mailbox because of his, quote, unorthodox performance, Cavett quickly pointed out that this man was in the 101st Airborne. Hendrix continued, "I didn't think it was unorthodox. I thought it was beautiful." But there is something more happening in this performance. I also read Hendrix's signifying on the sacrosanct national anthem as a statement about the ways in which historically marginalized groups, especially people of color, especially Black folk, have left and continue to leave their own imprint on American culture. So even if we take him at his word that he was simply an artist creating something that he found aesthetically appealing, art and politics can never be separated. Just as Black is beautiful was a phrase and ideology that clapped back at narrow Eurocentric metrics of physical beauty, Hendrix's labeling of his performance as beautiful also disrupts European and European American musical aesthetics. So it's not just the sound of his performance at Woodstock, but also the iconic image of Hendrix that embodies resistance. So as you can see in this photograph, his afro is garnished with the red headband. He's wearing 2 stud earrings, 2 rings, and a turquoise necklace. He dons a leather white fringed shirt that appears to be dotted with turquoise blue beads and blue bell-bottom jeans. The red, white, and blue of the outfit may represent the colors of the American flag. And despite the fact that some see Hendrix's rendition as a desecration of the national anthem, he did have respect for the United States and those who served in uniform, and in fact, he was a veteran himself. The fringed shirt is perhaps the most intriguing portion of this outfit. Not only does the fringe evoke native ornamentation, but the decoration is also reminiscent of Indian beadwork that is the hallmark of certain tribes. His fringed shirt may function as a kind of shorthand symbol of Indian identity for a man who is read as monoracially Black. Yet ultimately, the combination of clothing and accessory choices and music in his Woodstock performance and outfit suggests a kind of integrated multiracial self that Hendrix envisions himself to be. He could be American, Native, and Black without having to choose one over the other, even though at the time, many people did not see those as intersecting identities. His musical aesthetic and intellectual influences came from many different sources, and he did not want to be pigeonholed. Hendrix wrote about this frustration at the height of his fame. "Sometimes when I come up to Harlem, people look at my music and say, 'Is that white or Black?' I say, 'Why are you trying to dissect it? Try to go by the feeling of it.' People are too hung up on musical categories. They won't listen to something because it sounds completely alien." Hendrix sought to transcend racial and musical categories that he found restrictive. Yet he was not post-racial in the 21st century sense of the term. Hendrix understood his own identity as a mixed-race man of color, living in a time when nationalist movements erected boundaries between communities. His private writings, song lyrics, and public persona reflect both an awareness of the very real existence of racial hatred and racial divisions, and a refusal to succumb to discourses of racial authenticity. So I want to move to resilience next. Jumoke, I don't know if you wanted to jump in or if I should just keep going.
Thank you. I think resistance, the way the three characters or the three people you use to really describe resistance, like three different forms of resistance. And the clarification that resistance is not disobedient, but how they used, what they had available to them to kind of not let the situation adversely impact them. And exactly. I think that's key. I don't know if, in your research, you saw a lot of that, because when people hear resistance, automatically it's like disobedient or doing something wrong. But right. It's really the ability not to be adversely impacted by your situation. And I'm just so touched by Harriet Jacobs. So if you can just kind of speak a little bit about that before we move into resilience. Thank you.
Yeah, that's such a great question. Thank you for that, Jumoke. I mean, yes, I think resistance can look like disobedience. Resistance can take the form of running away from enslavement or breaking laws that are unjust and immoral, taking a knee during the national anthem, refusing to capitulate to racist dress codes in school and work environments. But I think, as you're saying, resistance is often more nuanced, and it sometimes happens in these quiet moments, right? I don't think Dr. Flint ever found out that Linda was sending those, or Jacobs was sending those letters and having a friend postmark them from New York, and so there was a kind of private delight, that she had in being able to watch him and, seeing him go to New York looking for him, all the while knowing, of course, that he wasn't going to find her. And, we as readers, knowing her story, reading her story so many years later, can delight in that, kind of tricksterism, that trickster moment in outwitting the master. But I also think about, resistance, especially with Black people, not just in the United States, but all around the world, resistance that gets enacted through language. So you can think about the ways that Black people have learned the colonizers or the enslavers' language, but made it their own, inflecting it with their own words and phrases and accents. And one really great description of that, study of that actually, is Zora Neale Hurston's essay from, I think it's from 1930, called Characteristics of Negro Expression. And as we know, she was not just a writer, but also a folklorist, an ethnographer who's very interested in Black culture around the world. And so she writes very specifically about all of the ways that Black people use language and use the English language in particular to make it their own. So I think if we pay attention, these acts of resistance are all around us. Thank you so much for that question.
Thank you. Even to this day, right?
Absolutely. Even to this day,
these different acts of resistance, just to continue to thrive. Yeah. Exactly.
And actually, if you don't mind, I have one more example that some people might know of, but one that always delights me. So there's a professor. Her name is Sammy Schock. She teaches women and gender studies at the University of Wisconsin at Madison. And she is a Black, queer, disabled professor who is a big fan of Lizzo. And in 2019, she went to a Lizzo concert and got on stage and fulfilled her dream of twerking with Lizzo. And it went viral. And, she's was very much, pushing back against a lot, against how professors are supposed to behave, how Black women are supposed to behave, how she identifies as fat. So how as a Black fat woman is supposed to use her body and share her body and take pleasure in her body, especially in public. And you can find the video on internet and also videos with her where she talks about the politics of pleasure and resistance. But yeah, I just love that example.
Thank you.
Sure, thank you. So, oops, somehow I got ahead. All right, so second part, resilience. And I just love this picture, must be from 70s or early 80s, of Toni Morrison with her two sons. So deeply intertwined with resistance is resilience, the quality of body, mind, and spirit that allows one to keep going in the face of struggle. And my work on Toni Morrison over the past several years has broadened the ways that I think about Black resilience. In her 1984 essay, Rootedness, Ancestor as Foundation, Morrison asserts that the novel should be beautiful and powerful, but it should also work. It should have something in it that enlightens, something in it that opens the door and points the way, something in it that suggests what the conflicts are, what the problems are. But it need not solve those problems because it is not a case study. It is not a recipe. Since 2011, I have taught both an undergraduate and a graduate seminar on Toni Morrison at San Francisco State. In both versions of the class, we read all 12 of her novels throughout a single semester. Engaging with Morrison's brilliance over the course of 16 weeks is rewarding, but also emotional. And I try to create space for students to share their intellectual and visceral responses to her work. And I try to model that in my own teaching. I will say that I don't get through this class without tears, and that's okay. At the end of my Morrison seminar about 5 years ago, I asked students to reflect on our journey together. And one student confessed to fearing that reading her novels would be really depressing. But by the end of the semester, she said that reading Morrison was like being punched in the face by the most beautiful fist ever. This vivid comparison underscores how reading Morrison elicits responses in us that are both intellectual and physical, sensual and spiritual. Moreover, her work challenges those binary oppositions that attempt to stratify these different ways of processing, validating, and sharing knowledge. That sense of resilience is what Morrison's work engenders. She takes us to these dark, difficult, painful places, but she also binds us in community through her gifted storytelling, acting as a griot who bears witness and asks us to do so as well. Throughout her life, Morrison explored the term Black literature and what we mean by that. She gestures towards a few definitions, but one that always stays with me and that is present in her own fiction is the presence of an ancestor. She writes, "There is always an elder there, and these ancestors are not just parents. They are sort of timeless people whose relationships to the characters are benevolent, instructive, and protective, and they provide a certain kind of wisdom." I always encourage my students to look for the ancestors in Morrison's novel, to reflect on what those figures are offering, and to consider how they challenge and support both the other characters, but also us as readers who engage with the text to make meaning and to delight in their genius. Whether it's Shadrach and Sula, Pilate in Song of Solomon, Baby Suggs in Beloved, or Aminya Mae in A Mercy, all of these ancestors who are fictional, but rooted in people we know and have known, encourage and fortify me. If they have made it, perhaps we can make it too. While the ancestors in Morrison's text are not always African, they nonetheless hearken to the land, language, spiritual and cultural practices of the continent. It may be hard for some of us to recognize these links to Africa in her work and in the work of other African-American writers. And that is, of course, by design. The Door of No Return at the edge of the Atlantic at the Cape Coast Castle in Ghana is a potent symbol of that rupture from our roots, and standing in its shadow was one of the more sobering moments during my visit in 2013. I am also reminded of a meeting that took place in 1980 between two great writers of the 20th century, US-born James Baldwin and Nigerian-born Chinua Achebe. And Chinua Achebe later wrote of this moment, "The occasion was an annual conference of the 5-year-old African Literature Association meeting that year in Gainesville, Florida. The association had invited Baldwin and me to open their conference with a conversation. Everything was going swimmingly. The tone was joyful and also serious. With typical hyperbole, Baldwin called me his buddy, a brother he had not seen in 400 years. The packed auditorium exploded in gleeful applause and nearly missed the terrible aside. It was never intended that we should meet." Achebe wrote elsewhere of the need to unearth the buried histories that link Africans and African Americans, and his call for critical engagement with the institutions that instigated this systemic severing from our roots speaks to my own experience as an American-born daughter of the African diaspora. While I'm no expert on the people, history, literature, traditions of Africa, I've been fortunate to spend time in Morocco, Tunisia, South Africa, and Ghana. I traveled to Africa with an awareness, at least on an intellectual level, of the linguistic, cultural, and ethnic diversity of the continent, as well as a healthy skepticism about any fantasy of a homecoming in which I would be welcomed with open arms. And while there were many moments in which I recognized my privilege as a US citizen and felt my otherness in Africa, I fingered the imprint of chains scraped onto stone floors, viewed the passage that connected the quarters of the white slavers with the dungeons of the enslaved African women. And I saw the wreaths left by visitors from around the world to honor those who died before, during, and after Middle Passage. And I was overwhelmed by my visceral response to seeing the impact of an institution that I thought I knew, but in fact was just beginning to know. I want to say that the connections were not always painful, however, as I also had the opportunity to see and hear a traditional Ghanaian dance troupe at the University of Cape Coast. I smiled when observing how their movements and gestures bore more than a passing resemblance to the dance moves of Black Americans who strutted their stuff on the episodes of Soul Train that I grew up watching. The pain and the joy are mingled as I contemplate what was lost and what remains.
Thank you. Toni Morrison is actually one of my favorite people in this world. She's a mentor.
Yes.
She doesn't know she's a mentor, but she's a mentor. She doesn't know me from anywhere. And I think with her, how she just really turns the resistance into resilience, just learning from the pain of the ancestors and refusing to be a victim. And celebrating Black excellence, not being defined by enslavement or whatever terminology people describe Blacks as, but that excellence and the pride in the strength of where she comes from, which is the resistance of the kind of I would say challenges like probably no other race in the world has ever faced, and still being able to thrive. So she's one person that I recommend. If you haven't read her books or watched her YouTube videos, she really demonstrates Black excellence and the need not to see yourself as a victim. You're impacted, and that's part of the resilience, because it's the resistance that build the resilience. Right. So
absolutely.
Yes. I just shared with you why she's one of my absolutely Black mentors. Share yours. Why do you find Toni so interesting, and her work and even her narration of her trip to Africa? It's always very hard not to also have those sad moments when like the Africans in the diaspora come to Africa. And see, just the similarity, yet the difference. Speak a little bit about, her resilience and what, what your perspective of her resilience is.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jumoke. Yeah, I co-sign everything that Jumoke said about Toni Morrison. Teaching and reading, getting to reread her works almost every year is one of the great joys of my life. She is a consummate storyteller who really understands the musicality of language. I mean, she's described before in a couple of places how she wants her stories, her novels to be like jazz. And there is absolutely a jazz-like quality, a lyrical quality, a quality that we can hear in other forms of Black expression. And I think one of the other things that has inspired me about her work is that she sees, or she saw the novel as kind of standing in for this oral culture, this storytelling, around a fire, the storytelling, on the porch that many of us don't have anymore. And so she is really stepping in to fill that gap. And one of the things that I just reflected on and just felt so deeply when she passed away in 2019 was how much she loved us, how much she loved Black people, and that she wrote for Black people. That's not to say that non-Black people can't and shouldn't appreciate her work. I'm not saying that at all, and she wouldn't say that at all. But she is writing for a Black audience that is going to, not all the time, but often pick up on these symbols, these sounds, these turns of phrases, these ways of doing things, these ways of knowing, right? I mean, she talks about, being both Black people being both very rational and also superstitious, and that those are not in conflict. We can embrace multiple ways of knowing ourselves, of knowing the world. And so often those other non-rational ways of knowing the world have been discredited. That's a knowledge that gets discredited, and so it's that those people become discredited. But I just feel on so many levels helps us to recover those ways of knowing in ourselves.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. And then I'd like to finish by talking about joy. It's hard sometimes to focus on joy, but I think it's really important that even as we celebrate resistance, resilience, recovery from trauma, from centuries of trauma, that we define ourselves not solely by our reactions to white supremacy. I hope that we can think about Black literature and art and music, not just as a response to the oppression that African Americans have experienced, but also as expressions of our life-affirming spirit. Nurturing expressions of Black joy is important to me, just as it is to the artists discussed today. And in a world where people of African descent are still dehumanized in ways large and small, Black joy can be a healing balm. So at a conference on the legacy of James Baldwin in Paris in 2016, I briefly met Cleaver Cruz, a Black queer Dominican American writer and educator who had just begun the Black Joy Project. And on Cruz's website, they share that the initiative came about after the sudden loss of their uncle in 2015, in the midst of them also doing a lot of organizing work in the community. So Cleaver writes, I had already made a commitment to not watch any more videos of Black death and continue refusing to repost them anywhere on the internet. I decided that my social media timelines needed some smiles amidst the sharing of important information, thoughts, art, photos, and videos that can be upsetting, and at its worst, depressing and traumatized. I posted a picture of my mom smiling and asked for others to post their hashtag Black Joy moments. I then decided to take on a 30-day personal challenge to share photos of Black joy. After a few weeks and a couple of moving responses, it seemed right to make this a regular installation and share it more openly. It was then that the Black Joy Project was formally born. It has been a little over 5 years now of traveling across the African diaspora to understand what Black joy means to Black people around the world, how it can be a source of healing, community building, and ultimately a contribution to revolutionary practices that will determine global Black liberation. And Cruz's words feel particularly potent in the wake of the circulation of the footage of the lynching of Tyree Nichols by Memphis police officers. I, for one, don't need to see images of Black suffering in order to be moved by it. And in fact, for me, watching such violence, especially against Black people, is triggering. I am moved by those who have shared joyful images of Tyree Nichols skateboarding, not only urging us to remember him smiling, generous, and full of life, but also calling out how making a spectacle of Black pain actually reinscribes trauma instead of releasing it. Highlighting images and sounds and expressions of Black joy on my timeline and in my life has been restorative. And I'd like to end with a brief example of Black joy that has been giving me sustenance lately. And I invite you to share your own during the discussion afterwards. So the clip that I'm going to share represents Black joy and Black genius across time and space, the collaboration of 3 artists, Dr. Ollie Watts Davis, an acclaimed classically trained soprano and music professor, Langston Hughes, the great American poet, social activist, novelist, playwright, and columnist, who was a central figure in the Harlem Renaissance, and Florence B. Price, an American classical composer, pianist, organist, and music teacher, whose considerable corpus of over 300 works was discovered in 2009. And I hope that you treasure as much as I do this video of Dr. Ollie Watts performing At the Feet of Jesus with words by Langston Hughes and music by Florence Price. Let's see if I can get this to work.
Delicious cereal with 0 sugar? It's yum-believable. Catalina Crunch.
Showing up on the first page of Google
Apologize for that.
might not be the best for everyone.
Okay. Can you see the video?
Yes.
Okay.
At the feet of Jesus, at the feet of Jesus, at the feet of Jesus, sorrow like a sea,
Thank you. Thank you
Thank you so much for your presence this afternoon. I'm so grateful to be in community with you and look forward to a little bit of discussion. Thank you, Jumoke.
Thank you so much. And you know what is so amazing? How even they used music, religion, as a form of resistance and resilience as well. It's still powerful, and you know that continues to be the case today. And even the religion that was used as a tool for enslavement became a tool for resistance and resilience. That's really. We have a few minutes left, so we're going to open it up now. Please raise your hand. We may be able to take one or two questions before we close. If you have any questions, please go ahead and raise your hand. If you just want to appreciate Sarita for giving us such a brilliant presentation, we appreciate that as well. Oh, so she wowed everyone to silence. Is that what it is? There are no questions. Okay, I think I see one hand. Oh, it's just thumbs up. Okay.
Oh, there's
Thumbs up.
Christine.
Oh, there's one hand.
Christine.
Okay. Christine, please go ahead.
Okay, now I think I'm unmuted. Thank you so much, Sarita. I didn't have time except to log on for nearish the tail end of this presentation, but it was just in time to see your snippet on joy and for the beautiful music, which really resonated and reverberated in my soul, the deep core of my soul, as it was expressed and finished at the end, and I could see it on your face too. And I would like to share that in my short journeys of spiritualism, you know, very recent compared to a great many out there. There are sometimes there's the foray into the dark night of the soul where one has to face one's deepest fears and challenges and ask why? And then there comes another time when that is all done, and that is partially done, when there is more to do in the future, but there can be snippets of joy that can be shared with oneself and shared with others, so that if only for a brief moment of peace, there can be the vibration that one is all and all is one. And that was what you shared just now with this beautiful music.
Wow. I'm
Really, wow.
I'm so moved by your words. Wow. I don't have anything. I don't know what to say.
I'm glad it came on. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Christine. She
Thank you
always
so much.
wows us with her
Incredible.
deep insight. Yeah, thank you.
Feel that
Thank
deeply.
you for sharing
Feel that deeply.
Yeah. Okay, over to you, Bernadette and Bear. Okay, McDaniels, you had your hand up?
Their hand, yeah.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Chris McDaniels. I'm the superintendent for SES. I just wanted to thank you for the presentation. I really enjoyed it. The end was fantastic. Through music, we communicate, and it reminds us of times in which we shared with our loved ones. So with both of my parents being in heaven, now the music kind of connected me not only with them, but with all of my ancestors that are resting in heaven right now. So I want to thank you for that moment. As I mentioned, music has a way of taking us back or taking us to a different place. And that certainly took me to a pleasant place with my parents and ancestors. So thank you for that. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
I'm so moved. Thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah, I didn't really talk too much about this, but I'm a singer. I've been singing since I was 10, and it continues to be a really nourishing part of my life. And I really see all of these different modes of expression, dance, music, literature, spoken word. They're all interconnected, and yeah, they absolutely bring me close to myself, but also to people who have been important in my life but are no longer here. So I'm so glad that I was able to give you that moment.
Thank you so much, Sarita. Thank
Thank
you. Bear, Benedict, okay. Over to you. Do you want to close this out, Bear?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Sarita.
Pleasure.
That was really heartfelt.
Thank you.
Yeah, at some point I was looking for
Hello.
some tissue.
Thank you.
Hello.
Thank you, Bayo. Thank you for yeah, finding me on the internet and sending me an email. So happy to be here and share this space with you, and excited for the rest of the events this month that you have lined up.
You
Yeah.
know, now that we found you, we are never going to let you go, right?
That's fine with me.
Mayo, can you tell everyone where the video will be after, where we will be posting it for the people that missed it? And then Professor Cannon, would you be so kind to post your email address one more time or put it in the chat for everyone?
Yeah, I'll put it in the chat.
Yeah, that's a good point, Clint. And we typically at the end of the month, we have, all the events. I think Public Works has a YouTube channel and it gets posted on there. So when we send out like the closing email, we include everything on there. But yeah, thank you so much. And I think when we talked to Professor Cannon, one of the challenges was she's teaching these courses over at SF State and also at Berkeley OLE program. And she's taking these classes for 13 weeks. And it's like, how are you going to compress? It's so much a thing of like trying to get it in, one or less than 1 hour. And you did a brilliant job. We're right on time, and thank you so much. Thanks for
It's been my
gracing us with
pleasure.
your presence. Yeah. So I would like to also remind everyone our next event will be next week, Tuesday. All our events are Tuesday with the exception of the Thursday one on the 23rd, I believe, with the racial equity group for redefining. Jumoke, can you help me with that one more time? It was, I think, really redefining our foundations.
Yes.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, so I'd like to welcome everyone. Like I said at the beginning, it is a journey, and we will be learning. And yeah, a lot of questions I believe are already being answered. But for now, thank you, everyone. I hope to see you next week, Tuesday. Thanks one more time, Professor Sarita.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. This was a delight.
Thank you.
Take care, everyone.